Good evening, classmates. My name is Earl McFarland, and this is the first discussion board for Hius512. So, coming into this week's discussion board, I was intrigued after reading the abstract of Chapter 5 in the book titled America's Guide from Jonathan Edwards to Abraham Lincoln. What sparked my interest was when author Mark Knowles said, and I quote, traditional Christians mostly oppose republicanism. I thought to myself, this just couldn't be right. And the reason why I questioned it was after I read Webster's dictionary, which defined republic as one, a state in which the supreme power rests in the body of citizens entitled to vote and is exercised by representatives chosen directly or indirectly by them. Number two, any body of persons viewed as a commonwealth. And lastly, number three, a state in which the head of government is not a monarch or a hereditary head of state. Pretty much speaking in line of how we went from colonies to fighting for independence. So after reading the definition, it made me question the original ideas of those that fled Europe for religious freedom. Surely they would support the ideas of rights and liberty for all people, freedoms that would protect them as well as other religious groups. So apparently this was a thing before the 1740s, and that was during a time when the old ways of strict religious dogma still reigned. However, the course of thought changed as American theology changed, adding more Christian Republican vocabulary. There was an obvious link between dissenting Protestantism and colonial wariness of British power, says Mark Knowles. Taxes started to split from England, and the Christian rhetoric was evident of that. For example, Cotton Mather's, in one of the prominent ministers of the time, spoke of taxes and laws, using the history of the Israelites as an example in his Massachusetts election sermon in 1692. In it, he said, in explaining the Israelites' turn from God, that they were punished with a slavery to man, a cruel Shishak had got under them the yokes of his arbitrary government. He goes on to say that there was no law and no tax imposed upon them except what their one acts concurred unto. Mathers asks, is it no well that all Christian liberties and all English liberties are by the royal charter effectually secured unto us? This shows that our founding fathers, that which was the political side, and the religious leaders like Mathers and Jonathan Edwards, were moving in the same direction with their thinking, planning, and rhetoric. Important power players in the American religious setting, particularly during the colonial revivals, were George Whitefield, Gilbert Tennent, and Jonathan Edwards, among others. Each knew the impact of the use of vocabulary of dissenting politics. For example, George Tennent, with cause, told his congregation in New Brunswick, New Jersey, that nothing mattered more than coming to experience, quote, everlasting liberty from bondage and servitude, end quote. So we can kind of see how the tide was turning on the other side of the conversation. We had the politics on one side and the religious leaders on the other, pushing the same rhetoric of freedom and liberty. To me, this is interesting because I've always wondered, how did the 13 colonies that were pretty much separate in politics, laws, and etc. come together to fight against England, to fight for freedom and the right to liberty? Mark A. Knowles does a great job in painting a complete picture that most would not otherwise, beside historians of the Americas and American revolutions, would understand. I, for one, never thought of the two groups as having the same agenda, because in the past I would read, and in previous classes in undergrad, the study of American Revolution and Great Awakening, but I never saw that the two were connected on the political playing field. When speaking of the Great Awakenings, we know that they came when the passion for religion had grown stale. We can say the same on the political side of the house because the love, I would say, for the mother country, England, had grown stale. I want to point out another author's perspective on this topic. In his book titled Pleading for Reform and Demanding Freedom, author John Ragosta talks about how Virginia legislation needed and requested the support of the religious dissenters and relied on the clergymen to convince their flock to take up arms against the 18th century superpower, England. A perfect David and Goliath story. This ties in with Mark Knowles' writings on the importance of religious republicanism, and if not for that, the colonies may not have won against the British. And that is an interesting thought indeed.